Good morning and welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming and for getting up early. For those of you who are here for the first time or for the first time in a long time, welcome. I'm Larry Gennari from Gennari Aronson. For folks who don't know us, we are a law firm serving entrepreneurs, innovative companies, and the investors who finance them through everything from innovation to execution, day-to-day corporate work, M&A, and most recently, public offerings. So we're very, very excited to have you here. We always tell our clients that our first job is to help them become successful. And so this Business Ideas and Book Festival is really advancing that goal. And so we really hope that you'll enjoy it. There's a quote in the hall from John Gardner, and if the folks who haven't read his book, subtitle of which is The Individually Innovative Society. I think the original printing was in 1964. It is a terrific book, and he helps us frame the conference because he talks about innovators as people who not only contribute to thinking differently, but doing things differently, authors and innovators. So we've got a bunch of them here today. Also want to quickly thank our sponsors before we begin. So we could not have put this on except for the generous contribution of a few people. The Boston Business Journal, Doug Banks is somewhere here, where he's getting coffee. Doug Banks and Carolyn, here he is, executive editor of the Boston Business Journal, always supporting innovation and technology and, of course, writing about it. Other supporting sponsors, BNY Mellon, Wealth Management, Brenda Travellini and her team are here. The authors are curated, the ideas are curated, the sponsors are curated. Brenda and her team understand innovators, they understand entrepreneurs. She really gets it. So we're excited that she's supporting our event. Telemann Insurance, I see Chris Donovan and John Snyder, and I think Greg may be here. Also, you don't typically think of insurance companies as innovators. They are. They're smart, they're practical. I don't think I've ever called them with a particular client problem and had them say, I don't understand what to do. They do. They're terrific. Adam McGowan from Firefield. This is a boutique tech firm. If you don't have a CTO or your CTO needs some help and support, Adam gets it, big picture. What I love about Adam is that he also has the ethos of our event, which is to pay it forward. He's created this really innovative Spark series, group of pulling people together for orchestrated serendipity. He does pay it forward, so firefield.com. Take a look at that. Ty Boston. Ty Boston has been helping entrepreneurs and innovators find mentors, connections, dollars since 1997. So we want to thank Ty. They promoted our event at Startup Con a couple of weeks ago where they had 1,000 people in attendance. And last, but certainly not least, Wellesley Books in the back. Yeah, support your independent booksellers. So these are great ideas, great authors, and we encourage you to take time in between each session to meet them, buy a book, and get it signed. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So our first panel is Innovation to Execution. And we have some terrific books, which I have in front of me, as well as some terrific authors. And let me introduce them and then kind of give you the framework. Directly next to me, and the author of the Sales Survival Handbook, Cold Calls, Commissions, and Caffeine Addiction, The Real Truth About Life in Sales, is Ken Kupchik. Ken is a writer, speaker, consultant with substantial sales and marketing experience across a broad variety of companies. I know firsthand about his incredible skill and vision in marketing when we've worked together. He's also the creator of Sales Humor, saleshumor.com, right? If you haven't seen it, take a look at it. It's one of the most popular social media sites in the business world. Ken is a first-generation immigrant and a graduate of the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. And again, this is his book. Directly next to him, Tsedal Neely. Tsedal's an associate professor in the Organizational Behavior Unit at HBS, where her most recent work focuses on the challenge that global collaborators face when they work across national boundaries. Her terrific book is The Language of Global Success, How a Common Tongue Transforms Multinational Organizations. This isn't just about language. It's about understanding people. It's about us. So I'm so excited about this and that Tsedal is here. Prior to Tsedal's academic career, she spent 10 years in industry working for companies like Lucent and the Forum Corporation in various capacities. She received her PhD from Stanford, the School of Management Science and Engineering, and she's also a Stanford University School of Engineering Lieberman Award recipient for excellence in teaching and research, as well as a Stanford Distinguished Alumni Scholar. Obviously an underachiever, and importantly, Tsedal is fluent in 4 languages. Next to her, Bharat Anand. Bharat is, of course, the author of The Content Trap. Folks who have been here before, we did a book launch party for Bharat, and then I roped him into being an advisor for the Authors Innovators Business Ideas Festival. He has been so generous with his insights and his thoughts, and this book is just a terrific, smart, practical way of thinking about connecting your customers. So we'll talk more about that, but I wanted to make sure I acknowledge all of the founders. All of the founders in the room know this. Bharat is a founder of this and a great friend, so thank you for your help. Bharat is the Henry Byers Professor of Business Administration and Strategy Unit at HBS. He also serves on the university's HBX, is really one of the heads of the HBX initiative, which he'll talk more about. Bharat received his PhD from Princeton and his AB from Harvard. And last but certainly not least, Dan Mcginn. Dan is the author of, got it right here, Psyched Up. This is a really fun book and a great read, How the Science of Mental Preparation Can Help You Succeed. Dan is a senior editor at the Harvard Business Review, where he edits the Idea Watch and How I Did It sections and manages the magazine's annual Best Performing CEOs in the World ranking. Prior to joining the Harvard Business Review in 2010, Dan has spent 17 years as a reporter, bureau chief, national correspondent, and senior editor at Newsweek. So he certainly understands culture and entrepreneurial culture. Dan holds a BS from BC, go BC, and an MBA from Auburn University. So delighted that you're all here. So innovation to execution, I think what we'll do is really, I want to frame some of the books for you so that you'll have a context. Every early stage team, every board member trying to get a company off the ground always benefits from a great board of advisors. So I really want all of you to think about this as your world-class board of advisors. They come at it from different perspectives, and their books really outline that kind of perspective, that there are different things, so many things that matter as you're getting started as a company, and they're going to talk about some of them. So what do these books have in common? They all seem to be on disparate topics within the broad framework of business. I think the thing they have in common is what I'd call connections. So when you think about sales survival, the Sales Survival Guide, you think about connecting customers and sales, connecting your team to being able to make sales. The language of global success, connections among teams, whether they're in the same room or around the world. Are they speaking the same language? Psyched Up, connecting to yourself. What is it that gets you ready? Is it that lucky pen? Is it that mantra? Is it that music? How do you connect yourself to the big challenges of your new company? And importantly, how do you connect your team to the big challenges that your company will encounter? And for Content Trap, importantly, it is about connections. What are the connections among users? What are the connections among products and functionalities? Because if you miss that and just look at the content, you've missed all of those connections. So that's where your board of advisors is coming from. So Dan, I'm going to start with you. You have a terrific quote in your book. In helping humans perform, psychology is the software, but biology is the hardware. So creating a company is an incredibly daunting position. And what do founders need to understand about themselves and then about their team to really think about as they're getting started?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for the invitation to be here. Thank all of you for your attendance and your attention. I honestly don't know if Larry's a good lawyer at all, but I think if law doesn't work out for him, he can go operate a bookstore. 'Cause I've never seen anybody so enthusiastic about all kinds of books.
Oprah's my role model.
So,
Everyone gets a book.
so thank you for being here. So to launch a company, to pitch VCs, get investors, hire those first employees, you've got to have a great idea. You have to have substance. You have to have practiced your pitch. What my book is about is the part that comes after the substance and after the practice. If you want to be a piano player, you better have played the piano a whole lot, but there comes that moment when you're about to go into the audition. It's 10 minutes away. You're sitting there, you're nervous. You're worrying about whether you're going to get the payoff from all that practice. You're worrying about all the times you practice your slide deck for your pitch, whether you're going to be able to deliver in the room with the people who matter. This book is about finding the right techniques to get yourself in the right mindset, to control your emotions, to find the things that are going to get you the right mix of confidence and calm and give you the right attitude to succeed in there. It's based a lot on what athletes do before a game. We're in New England, so we're all big sports fans. On Sunday, watch Tom Brady the 10 minutes before the game, what he's doing. Watch the basketball players on the court with their headphones during warm-ups. They're doing something very specific. They were probably taught to do it by a sports psychologist. This book argues that if you're a salesperson, if you're a CEO, if you're an entrepreneur, you should learn to do that same thing.
Terrific. So sticking with this connection theme on the team, we're still focused on the team. Ken, you describe sales as the world's second oldest profession. And there's just a terrific outline of the various caricatures of sales folks. So as you're starting with this team, sales will only come if you've thought about this, both in yourself and the team you have around it. So what does the team need to understand about sales and survival, and what can they get from this book?
Sure. So, Larry, thanks for having me here. For the record, Larry told me it was okay to wear jeans.
I have to wear the uniform. You do not.
I'm the only one. So, to answer your question, I think what sales teams need to understand are it's important to have a structure for your sales team. You can't just hire salespeople off the street and throw them to the wolves and assume that they can wing it. A good salesperson can succeed in any organization, but they need to understand very clearly what the value proposition of your company is, what pain points you're trying to solve. They're not just gonna, a good salesperson can sell your product, but they need to understand what they're selling. They should also expect rejection. My book talks about that a lot.
Oh yeah, we'll get to that. That's fun.
And I think a good salesperson and probably a good CEO needs to understand that you are going to get rejected more often than not, and that's okay. That it's part of going through the process. It's nothing unusual, and to expect it. And if you do expect rejection, it's really not as painful when it does happen.
So for our team, CEOs got to understand motivation for themselves and their team. For sales folks, they need to buy the book and read it. We'll start that way. Tsedal's terrific book, The Language of Global Success. Tsedal, for the team might not be thinking about global sales. This is really about a global organization, people speaking the same language. But fundamentally, I was telling Tsedal before the event, she starts off with just a terrific illustration, because that's always the best way to illustrate a point, the Tower of Babel. This is a book about human interaction. So, Tsedal, what does that team need to know? Those folks who say, look, we're not going to go overseas in our first 6 months. We don't even need a language strategy.
Right. So that's probably one of the failure points in terms of globalization for many companies who are not looking to do cross-border work and are not setting up the type of infrastructure, systems, and processes to do that cross-border work. But eventually, most companies are thinking about how do I expand globally, whether the market share domestically is not allowing them to grow, and even to leverage costs and other things, they have to think cross-border, going to other countries. And the first problem that they encounter is, wait, we have multilingual, multicultural folks who are interacting through email and video conferencing, and we need them to be effective, we need them to be efficient. How do we do that? And language clearly is the most fundamental means for people to engage one another. But this book takes it a few steps further. I studied one company's globalization process for a period of 5 years, looking at the workforce, looking at the strategy, and learned that it's about language, it's about culture, it's also about corporate culture. If we truly believe that corporate culture is our edge, our competitive advantage, meaning our values, what's important to us, what are our norms, what are our behaviors, once you have your corporate culture set, how do you spread it across borders so that every employee, no matter where they live, no matter who they are living up to the corporate culture that you've set up? Language is the only way to do it, and this book has evidenced that for me.
So you're hearing this from your board of advisors, folks. And last but not least, the content trap. And for those folks who haven't seen it, it's a book about digital change and how to navigate it. It's really the seminal book, I think, over the last few years about that. Bharat, the team needs to understand that having that website up might be a first step, but it's a step. Tell them what they need to know from the content trap about the content trap.
It's a big book.
It is a big book. It's a quick read, I promise.
No, thanks, Larry. And again, like others have said, thanks for having me here. So I think the instinct of entrepreneurs, managers in most organizations, you're starting a new business. I think the instinct or the tendency, and this is probably true for 90% of organizations, is let's create a fabulous product that might serve a customer need, and I'll come back to that, as Ken was saying, that's really important. And that's obviously important, but one of the things that I saw over the last 20 years, so the book really focuses on digital change in the media sector as a space which has sort of been trying to deal with digital for about a quarter century now, and the question is, what lessons have we learned? And it turns out that approach, which is focusing on best product, or in this case, best content, might not be enough. In fact, might end up losing the game. And the core idea is actually quite simple. It's, and it's blindingly obvious once I say it, which is if you think about sort of what digital really provided to us, or what it offers, digital technologies, compared to previous technologies. What's fundamentally different is it's not simply about saying, let's expand reach, which is the way we often think, right? So there's a fascinating set of data, part of which I borrowed from someone else. If you look at online news killing newspapers, you say, why did this happen? Oh, it's, things are faster, better, cheaper. And you'd expect that declines in print readership sort of accelerated after the mid-90s or 2000s. It turns out that decline is essentially linear for 70 years. There's no difference between the internet and radio, TV, cable TV that came before. What really killed newspapers is nothing to do with the content. It was the classifieds business essentially got destroyed. Now what's interesting there, I think it's a metaphor for what's happening in digital at large. The content side of the business, you gain or lose customers one by one. On the classified side of the business, that's essentially a platform. You're connecting customers. And that's what's fundamental about digital, right? It's not one to many, it's many to many. And how do we tap into that? I guess is the fundamental question. This comes back, Ken, to partly what you're saying. Understanding the customer need at a deep level, but also how customers connect. That's, in some sense, the core idea.
When we're thinking about innovation execution, with team, Bharat, in so many cases, the sales folks and the team say, we've got to develop this sales and marketing strategy, but we'll let these folks figure out product.
Yeah.
You think they ought to talk to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two issues which I've been surprised by how resilient those issues are, and we sort of talk about them, but it comes back to really being fundamental, I think, particularly for entrepreneurs, not just for large organizations. One is the two core questions in strategy. Where do we play? How do we win? It's amazing how simple those questions are. And it's also amazing how little time most entrepreneurs actually spend on those questions. It's not like you need to nail it down or have the blueprint, but at least some understanding. And the second idea, I think, is sort of, again, going back to what Ken was saying, thinking really hard about the customer problem, right? What is that problem we're trying to solve? And I'm actually amazed at how little time most of us spend thinking about that. As Larry said, we set up a digital learning initiative at Harvard Business School 3 years ago. We spent about a month and a half just thinking about what's the problem we're trying to solve. I would say that's the best month and a half we spent. And that essentially is still our blueprint today. So that's, those are the two things. In terms of connecting, and then everything follows, right? I mean, sales and marketing and product, those are natural. Those are natural areas to align, but you've first got to figure out sort of what
All
you're
right,
trying to do.
so let's go there.
Yeah.
So connecting to customers. Your board of advisors has a few thoughts on those. Dan, we've got to get everybody figured out how we get this first sale. You talk about in the book, Erica Alioto at Yelp, trying to figure out what's going to work to motivate this team. We've got to add sales because you can't have a sustainable competitive advantage if you don't have revenues. So can you talk to a team about how they ought to be thinking about that, perhaps even using the example from the book?
Sure. So the thing that got me interested in writing this book actually goes back 30 years ago to when I was a high school athlete. I don't look very athletic. I'm not super athletic, but I was a bench warmer on the football and the basketball team. That vantage point gave me a great window into what the coaches would do to get us psyched up. Pep talks, rituals, the music we would listen to on the bus before the games. There's chapters in the book on that. Translate that to the business world. I argue that for most of us in our careers today, every day is not the same as it was. Some days are higher stakes than others. So I went to Yelp, which is a huge sales organization, on the last day of the month when they were fighting to hit
No
their
pressure.
quotas. Right, they sell usually 4 times as much on the last day of the month as they ordinarily do.
Wow.
And the sales leader there, she starts that morning in a room like this with 600-700 people, firing them up, trying to find the right words to get them to work a little bit harder, to be a little bit more connected, to be a little bit more motivated. And it turns out that there's an entire science behind what they call motivational language theory, which is what you should say in a pep talk to get people going. 3 elements. And you need to sort of decide what you're trying to do in advance with this. Number 1 is direction giving or strategy giving. That's the actual nuts and bolts of what you're trying to get them to do. Part 2 is empathy making, where you're trying to sort of connect with the people on a personal level to show them you care. The third thing is meaning making, where you're trying to take the task that they're doing, which may seem kind of small and minor, and connect it with some larger, more important mission. You're calling an auto mechanic trying to get them to buy a Yelp ad, but think about this. You're part of the larger goal to help us make our quota, to help us hire more of your friends, to help our bonuses be bigger. You try to sort of expand the mission. What's interesting is if you were to tape record a speech in that environment, which I did, and you were to send it off to academics who study motivational language theory, they can go through and highlight exactly what that sales leader is doing. Here's where she's being empathetic, here where she's engaging in meaning making. So a lot of people have never been taught this science, but if you're good at leading a sales force, you probably picked it up. If you're a football coach, you probably have sort of intuitively figured some of this out. I think understanding the science behind it can help you be a little bit more intentional and do it a little bit more effectively.
So you've heard it twice now. It's all about the customer. Bharat saying you can't even start. Dan saying you can't even start. Tsedal, Rakuten wanted to do this. This English is the lingua franca, I think, as you describe it. And they thought it was really important that even their Japanese employees speak English. And this was about connecting to customers, wasn't it?
That's exactly right. So on March 1st, 2010, the CEO of Rakuten steps up on a podium and announces to 7,000 of the Japanese employees in the room, and with 3,000 overseas employees listening in, that from this day forward, we're changing our working language from Japanese to English.
Why English?
Because English is the common language of business today.
Okay.
Fastest spreading language in human history. There are more English speakers in China than there are in the United States
Wow.
of America. People worried about, should I teach my children Mandarin so that they can compete? I always say, oh no, the Chinese are coming for us. So we need to prepare. So it's been the business language of the world for the last 35 years or so, and about 60% of multinationals have explicitly made a language strategy around English that they diffuse across their companies. And so the CEO of Rakuten, who, by the way, is the company, the new sponsor for the NBA, speaking of sports, with the Golden State Warriors, the Rakuten patch. I don't know if you've read that. That's that company. So he announced to his employees they had 2 years to clear a language proficiency test or face demotion.
Wow, that's motivating.
That's very motivating. And so why did he do this? He'd already reached 90% market share dominance in Japan. He's kind of the Alibaba of Japan. At this point, over some 200 million users of Rakuten, there's nowhere to grow. So the only way that they could grow was outside of Japan, and very, very fast. And in 7 years, through this language change and some global strategies, and little self-disclosure, I worked with them. They now have 1.1 billion users in 7 years.
Connecting to the customer.
Connecting to the customer worldwide.
Ken, connecting to these customers, you do a great job in helping potential sales folks say, it's not about you. It's about what they want to.
Right.
It's about how they're going to experience, about what they want in terms of products and services. What's your advice to that team that's saying we need to connect to customers? We've heard about making sure we motivate the team, making sure that we are thinking about how those customers connect. We're making sure that the team can speak a common language with the customer. What are you telling that team that they should know about connecting to customers?
So I think there are four words that every salesperson or anybody leading a sales organization needs to understand. And those are, how can I help? That is all that matters when you're selling a product or a service. How can I help you? It doesn't matter what I want as a salesperson. It doesn't matter what the CEO wants. It matters what the customer wants and what you can do for them. And I think any salesperson who has that mentality going into a call, going into a meeting, I think will have the right mentality to identify where the real pain point is, what problem you can solve.
So if revenues are the lifeblood of the company, so is money. And so many of our teams are trying to find either angel investors or venture capital or have a financing strategy as well. So many entrepreneurs and founders, of course, are encountering rejection. Ken, what do you tell them?
Well, I think...
Because I know you do in the book. You've got some terrific ways to deal with that. And by the way, if you were being pitched by a vendor who's read Ken's book, you should read it just for self-defense.
I think, again, the best way to get over rejection is to expect it. So, you need to have a what-if strategy. Go into a meeting prepared for any outcome. Do the research, prepare yourself, figure out how you're going to get over an objection. I think you're more asking about rejection, though. If you can't get over the objection, you got to move on, and you should always have enough deals in your pipeline, and your sales organization should always have enough deals where if you lose one, it's not going to make or break you. The worst thing you can possibly do is rely on one client or one customer to make your month or make your year.
I think Ken does a great job of framing it as, in part, as removing reasons for people to say no and overcoming those objections. So that's a terrific way to think about this as well. Tsedal, if we're going to pitch investors and we want to make sure that they understand that the company's intention is to compete globally, and so many founding teams have virtual team members, how important is having that common language when you're sitting in front of investors?
It's incredibly important. It's in fact critical because How do you prepare? How do you collaborate? How do you communicate? How do you follow up in the absence of a common language? And a common language also enables this cross-cultural understanding as well. And we kind of do it intuitively, but unless you're deliberate about the common language and the use of the common language, you always get these imbalances where some people are excluded from contributing as best as they could. Some people may need some skill development around the language, and ultimately, in the absence of that same language, you can't cohere as a team in order to present your best product to investors and customers.
What did the folks at Rakuten who already spoke English say when this directive came down? They did the happy dance saying, terrific, I don't have to learn anything.
They did.
What did they learn?
So the Rakuten employees in the US were euphoric. Things like, I've got that box checked. Nothing for me to do here. Ooh, thank goodness he picked my language. But within 2 years, things changed because the Japanese employees and even the employees in Europe and Germany and in France and in Brazil and Latin America developed their language skills, and suddenly what happened to the US employees was that the Japanese culture started to come at them in ways that it never came before. In fact, they had to be much more Japanese once others spoke their native language than
I love that
before.
insight. They spoke differently. They thought about things differently.
And they
So it
had
worked on
diff-
both sides.
If they had different demands. So the corporate culture was newly introduced to the US offices, and the most symbolic experience that they had was one day an encyclopedia-sized regulation book showed up to the US offices, New York and California. This thing had always existed but was never translated into English. So it shows up, and suddenly, oh, people have to wear their badges on this way. These are all the norms. Well, you need to work this way, we need you to do this, kind of like a Trojan horse, frankly. And the US employees were suddenly very stressed out in ways that they hadn't been before, because they truly began to understand the cultural demands, the corporate cultural demands that came from this company, and had to live up to them.
So if we're pitching investors, they need to look at that team and understand they work as a cohesive unit.
Yeah.
Bharat, we're pitching a potential investor. Investors are always looking for that sustainable competitive advantage. What business are you in? But also, how can you complement others? Because ultimately, investors are putting the money in and also asking the question, when am I going to get it back? And how quickly? And quite frequently, the exit could be an M&A. You talk a lot in the book about know what a complement is. Know whether you're a complement. Can you give some advice to the team about that?
Yeah, no, it's so this is language, right? This idea of a complement, and in some sense, it's just picking up on Tsedal's theme of language. I think it's much broader actually than just, are we speaking French or English or German or Japanese? I think even within English, the language we use to actually frame opportunities or challenges, I think turns out to be critical in business. So one of the things I'm talking about is, think about technology and how it's impacted what we do. The history of media for 100 years has essentially been a history of looking at new technology and thinking that this was essentially a threat, a substitute, a disruptor, right? That's the language we use.
Right.
It turns out in almost every case, it turns out to be exactly the opposite. Radio comes along, basically the music industry tried to kill commercial radio. Why? Free music is going to destroy us. And then of course, you find out later on that it helps. MTV comes along, we think this is going to kill music. VCRs come along, we think this will kill movies. In every case, it actually helps. So this language idea, I think is fundamental, which is we often frame things in terms of what I call negative connections, as opposed to positive connections. And the idea of complements is just one example. So what's a complement? A complement is anything. It's any product or service where if you have that complement available, it actually helps your core business. And why is this interesting? Because I think in most startups, in fact, in most innovative projects, innovations usually succeed, not just because you have a great product, but because you figured out the right complement.
You're a compliment.
Yeah.
And you give some great examples in the book.
So, one example is, you take the music industry. We've seen CD declines for about a decade. And we looked at it and said, what triggered this? Oh, it was piracy and file sharing, right? And that was essentially the conclusion. Piracy killed the music industry. As we know now, the labels sort of look at the problem very differently. The main reason why CDs declined was simply a format change from CDs to digital. And there's a chart in the book which sort of talks about this. When you look at previous format changes from vinyl to cassette to CDs, and just compare their rates of decline when the new format came along,
they're complements.
They literally look identical
Right.
to CD declines. So what are the complements here? If I simply think it's a format change, how can I make money in the new space? Oh, it turns out there's a lot of ways you can make money, right? Broadband internet access explodes, demand for that. So as Warner Music suffers, Time Warner Cable enjoys its best decade. MP3 players and hardware, this is essentially the rebirth of Apple. And most interestingly for the music labels was the explosion in the price of concerts, live events. So 30 years ago, essentially concerts were priced low. They were the advertisement for you to go and buy the CD. Now that relationship flips. And free music becomes the advertisement to go to the live concert, which you can't pirate. By the way, this is why Radiohead and Beyonce and Shakira for a long time, basically when you ask them, what do you think about piracy? They're like, we sort of don't care. Because they were making a lot more money on the concert. Of course, they've got to work harder. So that's just an example. Think about...
Essential to the investor pitch.
Essential to the investor pitch. And again, this comes back to the full customer experience. It's not just saying, I have a product which serves a need. I'm thinking about the full experience.
And so for an investor who's saying, I want to invest in a company that has full experience, it isn't about the usual size of the market, soundness of the revenue model. Boy, you better put this in your pitch deck. Here are our compliments.
Yeah, I mean, if I was looking at Michelin 100 years ago and said, what's your market share in tires? It's fantastic. One of the most interesting things this company does is start telling us where the best gourmet restaurants are. It's nothing to do with tires, right? And you're like,
Right.
Based on the logic of core competence, stop. Based on the logic of compliments, this is beautiful because you're going to tell us about those restaurants 300 miles away.
It is a great exercise for every company at every stage. Think about who your compliments are, because it might not be obvious. Dan, I learned about defensive pessimism from your book. So you're going into a pitch, and defensive pessimism would say, well, what's the worst that can happen? Great way to start. Or so you say, no, not so much.
Right. So when we think about the things we do to try to get ourselves in the right mindset before we go into something, a lot of our intuitive impulses aren't very good. Whether you're pitching a company, I've actually done this. So I have a daughter who's a teenager. She was going to get her driver's license a couple of years ago. We're driving to that, rite of passage, and she starts talking about what happens if she fails. And so I engage in defensive pessimism, which is, don't worry, a lot of your friends have failed. It won't, affect your social status.
Quite motivational, right.
You can just take it again in 2 weeks. You try to minimize the consequences, lower the stakes a little bit. It's actually a terrible thing to do because you're priming the person to fail. Instead, you want to take steps to try to boost their confidence. So you want to focus on how great she'd done in her practice, how many hours she'd put in. So a lot of this is sort of reframing to focus not on minimizing what can go wrong, but on sort of maximizing things that can go right. So one of the things you can do for that is a greatest hits strategy. So I've been doing a lot of podcasts to talk about the book. So what do I do before I get on a podcast? Well, I was on NPR a while ago, and they edited me to make me sound way better than I actually sound. So before I go on a podcast, it takes me about 2 minutes. I listened to myself on NPR from a few months ago because it reminds me.
You got to live up to that.
Yeah. I talked to a sales guy actually a few weeks ago, and we started talking about greatest hits, and he got this sort of sheepish tone to his voice, and he's like, listen, I have this thing. It's really embarrassing. I do before a big sales call. I don't really like to talk about it, but since you wrote a book about this, I'll tell you. So in his office, he has a crown. It was the crown that he had been given when he was voted the king of the prom. And he puts it on and wears it for a couple minutes before he makes his big sales call. And
Whatever works. Whatever
it sounds
works.
ridiculous, but what he says is, listen, I moved high schools as a junior, so I was really only in this high school for a year, and in that year, I'd managed to build rapport and to connect with people and to be likable and agreeable, and that crown reminds me of my ability to very instantly connect with people and build rapport, and that, as a salesperson, that's the mindset I want to be in when I go into that room. So a lot of the techniques in the book are kind of, might sound a little embarrassing. You have your psych up song, you're listening on the ride to your VC pitch, but there's actual proof that a lot of these things do work. Sports psychologists have done a lot of work. So don't be defensive pessimists, focus on your greatest hits.
And Dan has a great vignette in the book where he talks about the DJ at Fenway and how David Ortiz needed that song. And anybody who has watched Nomar Garcia-Parra knows about rituals and the like. So we have a few minutes before questions. So I want each of you, we talked about connections among the team, connecting sales, connecting to customers. We talked about connecting to a potential pitch. We only have so much. We could do this all day. As the board of advisors, Ken, I'll start with you. What do you want them to know? First of all, they've got to read the book. What's the one piece of advice you'd say? Don't forget this. You've got a lot going on as a founding team. You've just got that venture round. You're going to go out and conquer. Don't forget.
I would say don't forget to listen. I think as a sales organization, as a salesperson, and as a leader, you need to listen to people more than you speak. You might think it's about imposing your vision on whoever you're speaking with, but in reality, true value is created when you listen and you understand people's needs. So my advice would be to listen. I worked with this guy years ago as my sales manager, and this guy was always incredibly successful everywhere he worked. Always at the top of the board no matter what. And there was nothing amazing about this guy. He just looked like an average guy. He was a former Marine, but his personality wasn't anything too outrageous. Now he's a realtor. He makes over $1 million a year being a realtor. But I asked him one time, how is it that you're so successful as a sales rep everywhere you go? And he said, it's as simple as listening, because if you listen long enough, people will tell you exactly what you need to know to close the deal. So that would be what
great
I would
insight. Great insight. Tsedal?
Don't forget the global context, and don't just benchmark against other U.S. competitors and companies. Benchmark against global ones, and that has implications around how you design your workforce and prepare them for success to engage one another so that they can serve a global customer base.
Bharat, what's your takeaway?
I'll pick up on Ken's first point, which is listening, and sort of, I guess the question I'd ask is how do you win once you've listened? How do you win once you've listened? Take the time to really think hard about that, and then be prepared to be surprised.
Fair enough. And Dan?
The takeaway from my book is that despite what Malcolm Gladwell may have said in Outliers, the 10,000 hours of practice is not enough. Even if you've got that under your belt, you need to have an emotional capability to actually deliver on that. Bharat and I were talking earlier. His daughter is 13 and she's a squash player, and she just went to an elite squash camp. And he was surprised that they spent 30% of their time on the mental aspects of what it takes to actually perform, not on the technique. And I think most of us
I wanted her to read his book.
most of us spend a lot of time on the substance, the practice, the technique. Don't neglect the emotion to get yourself ready to perform.
Terrific. We have time for a couple of questions. Questions from folks? We've left you speechless. So the books are in the back. I hope you'll take some time in between sessions. We have 2 more terrific sessions coming up. Hope you'll take time to meet our terrific authors, to buy a book, and to meet some of our amazing innovators. Neil, who are our innovators for this panel?
Thanks, Larry. Good morning, everyone.
My partner Neil Aronson from Gennari Aronson.
Let me come over here so everyone can hear me. So we introduced last night 2 innovators. One is Truelytics. Brendan McSheffrey is here in the front. You can find out more about Truelytics. The other is Vermont farmstead cheese. This morning we have 4 innovators. Let me do all 4 now.
Why not? We
Why not?
can't say it enough.
So the first is Psyched, which is a company based in Waltham, which has developed innovative technology out of MIT that can measure defects in complex geometries and everything from airplane fuselages, et cetera, using a patented gel technology. And really cool applications in a number of different industries. The second is Gennari. If you know what Antiques Roadshow, et cetera, all the collectibles, et cetera, this is an online facility to buy everything from baseball trading cards to whatever you can imagine that's some unique antique. The third is Locomote. Let me say this correctly.
Locomote Media. They are filming us today. They are represented by the terrific green bus outside. We'll hear more from them later.
And the fourth is Wonderful, which is...
And Beth Santos is here. Hi, Beth.
Why don't you tell everybody what you're doing?
Yeah, so Wonderful is the first ever identity verified phone sharing network exclusively for women. We get factories all around the world and women for one other.
Very exciting. We're going to hear more about that in our second panel. So please join me in thanking our terrific authors and innovators, and please meet them in the back. We'll be back in 15 minutes.
Thank you.